So even if you don't want to turn on your cameras, please feel free to jump in throughout the presentation. The idea today is to have a fireside chat with Chris Caplice. So really to make it like super informal, just so you can get to know better the main instructor of the MicroMasters in Supply Chain Management. My plan is to start like by asking some questions to Dr. Chris, and then like having some time for you to ask your questions, so we can have like a nice conversation, like a group conversation. And it's actually really nice that, you know, we are like 12 people here, so it's 13 now. So really, like, I think like almost like all of you can ask your questions and just interact with Dr. Caplice directly. I'm Ima Borrella. Most of you know me already because I'm the main point of contact at MIT for you guys. And I already introduced the program a few weeks ago. I'm a research scientist at the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, and I'm the academic lead for the MicroMasters in Supply Chain Management program. So let me start by introducing Dr. Caplice very briefly. He has like a huge curriculum, but I just made a summary of like some key points, and then Chris can talk a little bit more about his career. So he's the executive director of the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics, where he's responsible for planning, management of research, education, and corporate outreach programs that we have. And he's also the director and the creator of the MITx MicroMasters program in supply chain management that you're all going through now. And this is the very first MicroMasters credential ever offered. So it was a very innovative initiative, and ours was the first one that came out. Chris is also the founder and co-director of the MIT Freight Lab, a research initiative that focuses on improving the way freight transportation is designed, procured, and managed. So if you have questions about how things move around the world, he's the person to ask. And in addition to his work at MIT, Dr. Caplice is also the chief scientist at DAT Freight and Analytics, the largest truckload freight marketplace in North America, with over $120 billion in market transactions. So yeah, this is a very brief summary. Chris, feel free to add other relevant things as we go. But first, to kick it off, I just wanted to ask you, how did you start it in supply chain management?
So so if anyone has questions, you can also just use the chat too. If you don't want to talk or anything, do that, and I encourage you. But I will cold call people if people don't ask me questions. So so I came in sideways. I finished my undergrad. I was a civil engineer. So I did structural engineering when I was an undergrad, went into the Army. That's how I paid for college. And so I was in the Corps of Engineers for 5 years. And I did a lot of surface transportation work, doing stuff in what was then West Germany back in the 80s. So it's a different world now. Although seeing Russia's invasion, that was what we prepped for in the mid 80s. So it was kind of strange seeing it happen 30 years, 40 years later. But anyway, so after I got out of the military, I knew I wanted to go get a master's degree, whether it's an MBA or a civil engineering or technical one. I went technical. And so I finished that up down at UT Austin, University of Texas in Austin, grade school. And what was transparent to me then is if I was going to continue in construction, civil engineering, and roads, I would be working for the government. And nothing against the government, but I don't want to work for the government. And so I wanted to be in the private sector. And so what that turned into was, instead of building the roads, operating on the roads. And so that's where a lot of people in the 80s and 90s kind of came into supply chain management. If they were civil engineering, they'd do transportation, and that got into logistics and became part of supply chain management. A lot of the inventory people came in from marketing and then kind of came in that way. There was no supply chain department in the 80s and 90s. It didn't exist. And so it kind of came in sideways. And it wasn't until I got my PhD, honestly, that I got into the industry itself, which is a strange way to get into the industry. But at that time, it was so nascent. It was a lot of people were coming in that way. And a lot of the bigger names now, people who created software and everything, did the same thing. When I came into transportation back in the 90s, the only person with a PhD in operations was Chris Lofgren, who was the president of Schneider Trucking. And he had a PhD out of Georgia Tech. And now you can't throw a stone without seeing analytics departments, technical departments and everything, brokerages, carrier shippers. So it's changed a bit. So it's kind of a long-winded answer in my saying I kind of came in sideways from civil engineering and kind of came into it from the analytical side.
Thanks, Chris. I think that's interesting because many people come to supply chain sideways. Even today, right? Now you can like get a degree in supply chain management, but we see
there's undergraduate degrees in supply chain management. Might be a little early for people to specialize, but still it's there. And people are talking about teaching it to high schoolers. The big difference is everyone now, since the pandemic, knows what a supply chain is. It's the thing that's stopping me from getting what I want. Right? And we take the heat. We're the, I joke that you typically in the United States there's a holiday called Thanksgiving where families come together, and historically it's a challenge because you have generations where they disagree on politics, right? So there's a lot of discussion and debate over Thanksgiving where younger generation don't agree with the older. And the supply chain changed all that because now everyone complained about the supply chain. So it kind of pushed politics aside for a couple of years anyway.
Yeah, it can become like more of like a mainstream topic, right? Before, my mother didn't know what a supply chain was. And now like everybody knows about that. Yeah.
She's an expert.
Yeah. So, okay, so my next question is, if you could change anything about your career path, what would it be?
Everything always works out. That's the weird thing. So I wouldn't want to change anything. You do an It's a Wonderful Life thing, and who knows what else will go wrong. But the one thing that I'm glad I did, and I wish I'd done it in a different way, was frontline experience. I think one of the biggest mistakes someone who's starting out their career can do is to jump straight into, say, consulting personally, without getting frontline experience on the ground. I got my frontline experience in the Army. I was running platoons and companies and those kind of things. So I dealt with frontline working. If you miss that, then I think that comes back to haunt you later on. As you try to become a VP of supply chain within a larger organization, you won't have that frontline experience, and that makes you less attractive. And so the thing I would love to be able to do different, I wish I had spent summers or spent some time actually working in DCs, to be honest, or working at a dock, actually frontline in supply chain. All of my frontline was different. It's still the same kind of thing, but I wish I had more direct hands-on experience, because I think that helps color and educate, what you do when you look at it theoretically. And so I wish I had more hands-on frontline experience in supply chain.
That's what some companies do, right? When you come in, like you have to rotate across all these different
rotation
positions.
Programs are the best things because they expose you to things and you learn what you don't like, which is good. So I think that any chance you have, if you're in your 20s, to get a rotational program, I think it just makes sense. Not necessarily for that job necessarily, but it helps you understand where you want your career path to go.
Okay. So what would you say was your biggest challenge?
My biggest challenge? Working with you? No, the biggest challenge is finding time. So anyone teaching will say this, the things that we do in academia, there's really only two things that we do. One is we innovate, come up with new ideas, however you do that, and then we disseminate. And whether that's through teaching or through writing, publishing, that's really all we do. So you innovate and disseminate. And the challenge is that the innovation takes time. You can't just set 20, or I can't anyway, set 20 minutes and be creative. And so finding the time to do that, because in addition to all the really cool things we do, we have the administrative tasks like any company, any organization. And so it's easy to get absorbed by the day-to-day minutia. And so what I find it always hard to do is to pull yourself back and you let email go and actually be creative. And I don't know about, everyone's a little different, right? And so for me, if I don't have a 4-hour block of time, I can't do it. I can't be creative in 20-minute bursts. And so my biggest challenge that I have is finding the time, granting myself the time, because the time's always there, but giving myself permission to like turn off the phone, not answer emails, let the organization run, and then actually try and do something creative. Because everything else comes from that. If you don't spend the time doing that, you have nothing to write about, nothing to teach, right? Or else it's very stale teaching. It's nothing that you really spend time thinking about. But that's my biggest challenge. But what is your biggest challenge as you work in this? Besides having 2 little kids running around.
It's an interview to you, Chris. But I think your challenge is also my challenge, right? I feel like sometimes we're in the like running the wheel, like the mice, and then like you don't have time to think. And we are researchers too, and we're teaching, so coming up with great ideas don't happen unless you really like find the time. Yeah. So as a segue to actually like your biggest challenge, you mentioned creativity and inspiration. So where do you find this inspiration when you have the time and when you carve out the time, these 4 hours at least?
There's a great quote by I want to say Chuck Prophet that said, "Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just show up for work." Right. And so the whole idea, if you can't just wait for inspiration to hit, because you could be doing that for hours. So the biggest thing you can do is you make it happen. You just lock yourself in a room and just force yourself to get it done. But a lot of times people say, well, I'll do this when inspiration hits me, and it rarely does. And so that it's the kind of thing, like when people say they're lucky, you have to be ready to be, to receive the luck. And so you got to be prepared, because luck favors the prepared. Just like that, the creative people who are the most creative are those who practice it and do it every day. You can't just say, okay, this third Thursday of the month, I'll be creative all day. You've got to just put in the work. If you talk to any musician, what they do, they put in the work. And so it's repetitive, it's constant, and you might not feel inspired that day, but you've got to still put in the work, because eventually you'll be prepared for when inspiration does hit. But waiting for inspiration, to me, is a cop-out. And so you've got to just deliver. And so as an example of that, to be honest, and you know this, and from creating this MicroMasters, the first course, this was a surprise. I did the first one on a whim, and I had all the time in the world for it, more or less. But then once it became something that MIT signed up for and we had to push behind it, we had to create 3 courses in 6 months. And that was tough. But having forced to do it, it forced you to be creative. You don't have a choice. So you get that done. And so I think too often people try to leave it open-ended, and whenever it's going to come, if you don't have a deadline, something to force it. But in my experience, it doesn't happen. So one of the tools that I do is I force myself to do it. I sign up, or I commit to write a publication. I commit to give a presentation on a topic I know I want to go on. So that is like a stake in the ground. I know I have to do it, because without that, the idea will just continue to percolate. So for me,
Chris, I have a question about the question of innovation or thinking or inventing new things. Don't you think it's also very much worthwhile talking to a lot of different people about, I think we cannot innovate alone. We cannot even innovate by twos. But I think by challenging ourselves and challenging ideas and going through with other people's way of thinking is also an excellent way of finding new ideas or new concepts or new ways of solving problems and so on. What do you think about?
I agree with that. There's 2 points I want to make for that. One is there's a difference between inventing and innovating. And there's a lot of interesting stuff here, a lot of books on these different topics, but invention can be done by yourself, where you have this brilliant idea and it comes out. But a lot of times those brilliant ideas go nowhere. You need more people to kind of launch that and bring it up to scale and actually innovate it and have it happen in practice, have the market look at it, whatever. But the point you make about needing to talk with other people, I agree with that 100%. We have a phrase we use here at CTL, that innovation happens at the fences. And at CTL at the center here, we have a group of companies, the exchange, about 50 companies, and we specifically get them from a wide variety of industries. So it's like Intel, Walmart, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, very different industries. And we do that on purpose, because we don't have just all the retailers talk to each other. Because to your point, Xavier, if they just talk to each other, nothing new comes in. But if I talk to someone who's doing, chips, I can learn something different. So it's at those fences that we think innovation really happens. And I agree with that 100%. You need to expose yourself to other ideas, because you don't know where a new idea is going to trigger something in your brain. And so I highly encourage people to go see other people speak. Don't stay in your narrow little niche. Go out and go wide, because you never know what's going to trigger an interesting thought or an interesting connection that you can make. That's a really good point.
So serendipity.
Yes. Yeah. You have to let it happen. You have to give yourself permission to do that, because it doesn't always pan out. Sometimes you go out and there's some really bad stuff out there. It's not worth the time, but you never know. You never know.
Right. So as a reminder, everyone, you can just put your questions in the chat, and I will include that in the interview if you don't want to jump in like Javier did. Otherwise, feel free to jump in, right? I have a list of questions here, but this is a conversation with all of you, so please feel free to ask questions. So since you mentioned, and I'm gonna jump a little bit ahead of my interview here, but you mentioned like the start of the MicroMasters. So I think it would be great to hear about it. How did you start the MicroMasters in Supply Chain Management program?
So in the spring of 2014, I was asked by Sanjay Sarma, who was the brand new Dean of Digital Learning, that they were interested in a supply chain course. So they asked if I wanted to do it. And so I said, sure, having no idea what it was. And so essentially they said, make a bunch of videos or whatever. So I spent the summer of 2014 putting that together. And essentially it was mimicking a course that I had been teaching for about, at that point, 10 plus years. And so that was relatively straightforward. And that's 1X, which they've taken 1X.
They're taking it now.
The very first lecture I filmed was EOQ. And you can probably tell, because the microphone was probably not great. We're upgrading these things now, but and so I did that, and then we launched it in September of 2014, and we had 30,000 people register, and it was me and a half-time TA. That was it, and so we were inundated. We were just buried, and of course, all the students complained, and there was rampant cheating, because all I did was I had 10 weeks, and I had a homework each one, and I'd let you see the answer if you got it wrong. And so there were a lot of hundreds going on. But because of the demand, we said, you know what, we're going to do some more of these. So we created SE2X, which you'll take next, I guess, in design. And then President Rafael Reif decided to make the MicroMasters and do this. And we were asked to be the first one, and we volunteered, even though that meant requiring designing 3 additional courses plus a CFX and all that. So once that hit, then a team came along. And that's when Ava came on board. Inma came on not very long after that. And so we actually had a team building this. And so I would say to your point, Xavier, someday you were saying, I did the first SC1X by myself. Honest to God, I did. That's why I'm in every video, all that kind of stuff. I made every slide. I had a TA who responded to the forum, but 100% was me. And that couldn't happen going forward. And so as we moved forward and scaled, we needed to bring in other people to do better jobs, because while I could do everything, I couldn't do everything as well as having a team. And so that's why you have the team now that does so much more and such a better experience. So to me, I learned a lot of things, but one is, yes, you can do something by yourself, and sometimes maybe that's what it takes, but it's always better when you have a team to support that, and you can expand what you can deliver. So I think there was a lot of serendipity, and I got lucky creating the course, and I was shocked by the demand. But it's been a great experience so far.
So the students are taking SE1X and SE3X now, and SE0X, the three courses at the same time, which is a little bit overwhelming, but they are doing great so far, I must say. So maybe could you share with us what is your favorite topic in SE1X and your favorite topic in SE3X, and why?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the news vendor. The problem, I think that's something that can really illuminate a lot of things. And I'm trying to think, because I did that 6-8 years ago now, and so I teach it. I probably changed how I teach it, but I just love the concepts of the overage and underage, and how you can just make trade-offs. Because I think the really cool thing about that whole course, if you really look at it, is that supply chain is just a series of trade-offs: cost and service, overage, underage, fixed cost, variable cost. Every single model you do, from forecasting to inventory, transportation, you're making trade-offs. And to me, the news vendor problem or the single period inventory model is kind of encapsulates that. It's the most clear and easiest thing to explain to someone where they understand that you have to make a choice of having too much or too little. You will never be exactly what you need. And so they're making those trade-offs, and you can see the news vendor problem show up everywhere. It shows up in fashion. It shows up obviously in seasonal goods, but we saw it in the pandemic. I remember we had a problem where we asked, where people were faced at pharmacies, is how many of the Pfizer vaccines do I get each day? And if I get those, how many people do I invite to come in and give them appointments? Because if I invite too few, then some vaccines will go to waste. If I invite too many, then they won't get service and they'll get embittered. So the news vendor gives us a framework to figure out, okay, is it better to have excess people or excess vaccines? And it gives you a framework to make that tough trade-off. So that's my favorite part of 1X. But what is yours? You've actually run more series of SC1X than I have. I'm just in the videos. You've seen it a million times.
Yeah, I love news vendor. Like, it's actually the first time I learned the model, it was like, it's so cool to me and so fun, and also the examples that you can find. But I love the inventory module in general. I love it. I love also periodic and continuous review policies and how you can switch from one to the other. So, and I swear we did not prepare it in advance because they are right now in week 7. But it's really, for me, it's the coolest part in the course.
So week 7, is that news vendor now?
News vendor, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Because 4 is what, EOQ?
Yeah.
And then they do.
And then they do periodic and review policies, and then transportation.
But you got to go with the triangle distribution. That's my favorite distribution.
Yeah. So they are going through that now, and that's also my favorite part.
Excellent.
Yeah. So yeah, and SC3X, Chris. Which part do you like?
Now, right? Because I'm only there for half of it, and so I think my favorite part is when we start talking about exogenous factors, disruptions that you can't control. Because 0x is all about the math techniques, which was in retrospect a mistake to make it be the first thing. And the way we did that is because I was using an analog kind of when I designed it. And that when you go to master's program, the first semester is always the toughest because they hit you with all the math. And so that's what I did online. But the difference is that a lot of people, they get hit with the math right up front. They say, well, this isn't for me. It's all math. I thought I was doing supply chain. And so in retrospect, what we could have done or should have done, and then what we've eventually done now, they can take it at any time, right? It's more of a reference course. So 0x is all about the techniques. 1x is the fundamental trade-offs, forecasting, inventory, transportation. 2x is designing, and you do a lot of mixed integer linear programming because that's embedded in a lot of systems and everything. How do I design my facilities, my network, all that? It's great. That's one of my favorites. And then 3x kind of changes the whole game because now it's suddenly like, oh yeah, there's a real world out there, and these things have consequences. And so what do you do with those things? And so the whole idea of tying the exogenous side of things into the supply chain, because that's what a supply chain is. It's both a bridge connecting you, suppliers to customers and everything in between, but it's also a shock absorber. And so what we do with this through the different techniques is to help people understand how does a supply chain prevent the company from imploding. Essentially, it's a shock absorber for when fuel doubles, when capacity is tight, when sourcing from a certain region goes away. So there's a lot of things you learn, and you get to understand and appreciate the strength of what a supply chain can do. What about you, and what's your favorite of 3X?
I love strategy, and I really like how it provides these little tools that, of course, they don't fix the strategy for you, but gives you a framework to think about the strategy for the supply chain. Although I think it's a little bit difficult to teach strategy in an online course. So I think it's great that SKEMA students do have some in-person classes with Xavier to actually complement what they learn online to expand on strategy for supply chain management.
That's a really good point in mind, and this is something I'm glad that you're doing that, Xavier, because what we found when we designed the MicroMasters, it was never designed to be complete by itself. It was always in parallel with another piece. And we've experimented with two different types of pieces. One is a semester here at MIT, which is the main thing where people will finish the MicroMasters, apply to MIT, come in, and they start in January, finish in June, and they get a master's degree. And during that spring semester, it's all case studies, discussion, all the things that we can't do online as well, especially in a massively open online course. And so I think you really need to complement what we do online with something with the discussion, because to Xavier's point is the talking with other people, getting other viewpoints. We found that doing case studies and open discussion, it can be done online asynchronously, it's not that well. You miss the element because it's more like you shout into the wilderness and then someone else will shout and post. It's hard to get that interaction. You can do it online synchronously like we're doing here, except no one's turning their cameras on. But it can be done, but it's harder. And so doing it in person, there's something so important about that. And I think being in the pandemic made a lot of people realize how important it is to have that close connection and have that connectivity really matters. You don't need to be there all the time, but you can really, it benefits having a meeting where people are actually face to face, where you have a discussion, because it's more than just a picture on a Zoom screen, right? You get the full picture to that. And so, yeah, I think you need to complement what we do online with instructions, because we focused on the more analytical side of things that are best handled online.
Yeah, I think the analytical part is great online because it provides instant feedback, and I think that's powerful. Please talk if you disagree. Maybe this is the moment. But I think also for the other part, the more qualitative part, it's great because you get all the teaching, but then you need to practice somehow. And I think for practicing and like creating together with other people through case studies and other dynamics, I think it's also very powerful. So yeah.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I am there by one thing, Kai. I'm wondering one question, compared to the MicroMaster started in 2014, do you think now there is a bigger change in all techniques and trade-offs in SC0X, SC1X, and SC3X concepts? And I'm not sure what I understand from that, but what the student is saying is that wouldn't there be some kind of evolution in the techniques that have been taught in 2014 and now?
Yeah, so the way that I approach anything with the MicroMasters is teaching the concepts, the techniques, and we tried to keep specific like software out of the main discussion. I think everything is in Excel or LibreOffice, just so you understand the basics, but we kept the specific platforms because those change rapidly. And so one of the big challenges we have right now is, do we introduce Python? Because that's the language of choice that we're doing here at MIT, and I decided we'll have it as a supplemental side, but we're not going to require it. But it's a really good point, and it brings up the perspective that I think I've tried to set for the whole MicroMasters is that I compare it to cars, right? There's three types of people, how they interact with vehicles. There's drivers, there's passengers, and there are mechanics. Right. And so if you're a mechanic, that's like knowing the nuts and bolts, everything about the machine. So that means you understand the mathematical techniques, you do the proofs, you understand how simplex works when you're solving a linear program. You understand the theorems and really know the math inside and out. These courses are not for that. At the other extreme is a passenger, and a passenger is just there for the ride, right? They press a button and they see a number and they're happy with it. They might be in an auxiliary function to supply chain, and they just need to know, how much should I order? And so they know enough to talk at the cocktail level, kind of like the conversations that happen around the family at Thanksgiving about supply chain. But they really don't know how it works. And that's not what we do either. What we do is the driver. We expect you to be able to drive the car. And to do that, you need to understand where you can and can't go. So for example, you should know when you're running a linear program, which you've learned in 0x, I hope, there is no, it's all deterministic, and that there is no uncertainty there. You should know these certain things because you should know the limits and the strengths and the weaknesses of all of these techniques. You don't need to know the proofs. I don't need you to go and prove the simplex, right? But you need to understand where the tool is appropriate and where it's not. So that's what the 3 levels I see, from a passenger to a driver to a mechanic. And so the big focus here is the fundamentals don't change. Fundamentals don't change. You're still making a trade-off. Now you might be able to make forecasting is a great example, because the software for forecasting has advanced so fast. And that's the next thing we're going to try to upgrade, is because I show how to do hold winter by hand in the spreadsheet. No one does hold winter by hand. But what it tells you, it shows you, if you go through it, you understand what's happening. Because unfortunately, there's some people who just put numbers in, get numbers out using R, SAS, Minitab, whatever, and they take it as gospel, even though it might violate some basic assumptions. So the software has moved so fast that a lot of people can use it. It's so easy to use that it gets misused. And so that's one of the challenges that I see coming up, is making sure that you understand the techniques that are getting done, but the basic fundamental trade-offs don't change. Now, for forecasting, again, some other things that I don't include in SE1X, and maybe we should, is ARIMA, another technique. Neural networks, to talk about some of those things. We're debating what to add in. Unfortunately, the bucket is only so big. Everything I put in, I got to take something out. And so that's the challenge that we're facing. But you raise a really good point. We try not to focus on the training of a software tool. We have little tutorials on those, but the fundamental concepts that any system is going to do, any software system to solve that problem. That's the intent anyway.
So there's another question from one of the students, which is kind of broad. So let me try to rephrase it a little bit. So the question is how to face a situation like a company that is facing revenue and market share losses for the past years. And which kind of supply chain strategy could be used to deal with this? I guess this depends on the context of why the company is is running into losses. But I don't know, maybe I don't know, Chris, if we could talk about different supply chain strategies.
So is it in 3X where we talk about failure mode analysis? Is that in 3X or is I lost track? Or is that 4X? I think it's 3X.
Could you repeat that, Chris?
Failure mode analysis, the fishbone.
Yeah, it's in SE3X.
Yeah, so the whole thing is, because Inna's exactly right. Why are you facing revenue and market share losses? Because it could be because your marketing is horrible. It could be because your product is bad. It could be that you don't have inventory on the shelves. It could be that you're overpriced for your market. There's so many different ways, and supply chain can help with some of those. A supply chain can't help you with a marketing campaign. Now, it can help synchronize, like sales and operations planning. We can talk about how to synchronize the sales with the production to make sure that they match. And there's some lessons there, but there's no silver bullet for this. You'd have to say, okay, what is the exact problem? The reason why I was asking him about failure mode analysis, because it's a very powerful technique to say, okay, let's just pick one. Why is my market share declining? And you can think of all the possible reasons, right? Think of it like a fishbone diagram. And then each of those, you can think about, okay, why is that happening? What can I do? It's a way of taking the problem that's so massive, I'm losing market share, and going to say, okay, why? Is it technology? Is it the people? Is it the process? Is it something else? And once you identify the potential sources, then you can start saying, okay, where should I put my attention on? And maybe I can solve a problem and see if supply chain can help there. Because if it's because you're losing market share because your inventory isn't there, that's a supply chain fix. Or if your product tends to be damaged, you have a high damage rate, that's a supply chain issue because you're probably not transporting it well. So it depends on what the exact problem is, but I think you can use some of the steps we talk about in 3X to hone in on where the real problem is. What's the causal factor, and not just market share loss. I hope that makes sense, Global. But you can add more if you have more specific questions.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think if you have more questions or want to expand on the response, just please let us know, Gokulram. But thanks, Chris, for being so specific and providing a specific tool for him to dive into this issue if he wants to.
And Gokul, you sent that to me. Did you send that to everyone? I assume.
Who?
Gokul, he sent, it looks like a direct message.
Yeah, he sent a direct message. That's why the rest of the people can't see it. But then there's another question by Sami Bachir. And the question is, how much is it a disadvantage to have never used Python? And do you think it is possible to overcome this? And actually, this can connect also with a question that I had, Chris, that is, what skills do supply chain management professionals need to be successful in today's job market?
All the things for any job to be successful, you have to be, know your technical skills. That's what we're teaching. But even more important than that, to be a problem solver, work well with people. All those basic managerial things are really important for all these things. But as far as like technical things for that, Python, it seems to be pretty dominant right now. But the way to overcome it is to take a Python. I mean, I did. I think my certificate. Yeah, my MITx certificate verified. I don't know if you can see it. Oh,
wait, no, you have the background.
We'll have to bring it in. So I took it at the same time. We all took it together, didn't we?
We did take it together, yeah. And I highly recommend it. It's super fun course, and it's on EDX.
Yeah, so I think if you're going to learn a language right now and you're starting from scratch, Python might be the way to go. I learned on my first language was Fortran on punch cards, so I'm old. And then basic and C. Well, my dissertation was in C, not in C++. And those are great languages. You can do a lot of stuff with them. Python, it seems to be the dominant language of practitioners, and you'll see it here. R was pretty strong for a while, but that's mainly pure statistics. And so I think if you had to choose between the two, Python, just play with it. And again, it's like that. It's something you can't say, well, next Thursday I'm going to do it. You need to do a little bit of coding all the time, every day, every other day, because if not, you'll lose it. But it's a very powerful tool. It's a good way of, because the reason why we introduced it here at MIT, we make all the master students take it before they show up, right? And then we reinforce it because they all have to solve a problem with a company. And what we found is that they're getting, gigabytes of data. And you can't put a gigabyte of data in a spreadsheet. And a lot of people use the spreadsheet. It's a great tool as like the analytic engine. It's not. And so by using Python and other tools, you're able to handle larger data sets. And it lets you do so much more. It gives you a lot of flexibility and also lets you make it repeatable. Because one of the problems with using Excel, and everyone falls into this trap, you get something and you do all these things, but then if you get new data, you have to do those things again. And it's done by hand. What Python allows you to do, it allows you to build in repetition. So once I build the process, if I get new data, fine, I just through the same process. So it allows you to scale much faster as opposed to doing something in a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets are great for like messing around, trying to understand things, very informal. But Python's a nice added tool in your tool belt. I would encourage you guys to take a course. It's intimidating, it has a steeper learning curve than Excel, but it's not that steep. And dip your toe in the water and just start coding.
And I think you mentioned it a bit earlier, Chris, but we are working on introducing Python in the MicroMasters. So the first course is going to be SC0X. We're working on it. The plan is to have it in January, at least the initial recitations that is going to be like specifically about optimization, some mixed integer linear programming. But yeah, you will find some Python tools into our courses. Of course, they're going to be like.
But it's not required.
Not required.
You don't have to do it because a lot of it's still not as common. And you can be a manager of a very successful career in supply chain and never learn how to code Python. I mean, it's not like it's going to be required for a vice president. But it helps you do a couple of things. It helps you understand. As you move up, you'll have people who will be coding for you, maybe. And if you've done it yourself, it helps with the process. You know what it can do and cannot do. It's harder for you to get hoodwinked. for that, so you understand the process. And that's what a lot of the SC2X and 3X is all about, is understanding the details of stuff so that you might not be doing that function, but you understand what's going on.
Great. So no more questions so far. So let me ask one of mine, or maybe Thorsten, do you want to ask something?
Yes, a very typical question. So my students are kind of now in the beginning of the program, but the beginning is close to the end of the program. So two questions. If you are in supply chain management in the beginning of the career, question one: how do you think does the MIT MicroMaster help you with getting into a career in supply chain management? And second, how would you recommend, what are steps to enter successful, beside doing a master degree and a MicroMaster, what are steps to enter successfully into the area of supply chain management and procurement?
Great question. So the first, what the MicroMaster helps is, one is, if you're fresh to this industry, you're getting all the terminology, you're getting the nomenclature, what the real problems are. So one of the challenges is if you go to interview for a job and you don't understand what safety stock is, right? And you don't understand, someone talks about lead time, you have no clue what that is. So just understanding the trade-offs and the terminology. I can tell you, whenever we have people interview for things here at MIT, like a postdoc for a position, if they can't tie it to something real and use the actual terminology, then that tells me that they really don't know this area. They haven't spent any time with it. So one is it's exposure and getting you used to it. The second thing it shows, and this is something that we confirm with hiring managers from a bunch of different companies, if you finish the MicroMasters, that's awesome. You learn a bunch of great stuff and the content's there, but the actually doing the MicroMasters demonstrates something else, and that's great. It's that you have the determination to actually do these things and do it over and over, because no one's standing over you, hitting you over the head. You're doing it kind of on your own and pushing yourself through. So that shows that you can stick to and complete a task. And that's something that is very valuable. So I think the MicroMasters, is it the end all be all for your training and your education? No, education never stops, but it ramps you up to get in, and definitely early to mid career. I think it's very helpful because you learn a fuller scope of things. And then the second part of your question was steps to do to enter the workforce. I say just get out there. And here's one of the challenges that I have with the students here at MIT. They think if you don't work for McKinsey, Apple, Amazon, or Tesla right out of your grad school, you fail, because that's why we came here, and it's so disappointing. I would recommend you don't pick the company, pick the role. And what I was talking about, that frontline experience, I think the best thing you could do is have your first job be as dirty as possible. That means getting into a DC, running a DC, running a loading dock, running a forecasting team, actually getting your hands dirty rather than jumping up and, flying around as a consultant, because that'll come back to bite you in 10 years, 15 years. You really need, I think the best thing you can do is get your hands dirty, get that operational experience. Your first job out of a master's degree will not be your last job. It won't be your last company, right? The average tenure now, I want to say 13 is what, 2 to 3 years, if that, for companies, for your first company. You're just getting experience. So my recommendation is go as dirty and as frontline as you possibly can. See how things really work, rather than just going after a name that might look good on your resume. I don't know, but you've done as much education stuff as I have, if not more. What do you recommend?
So I worked as a consultant for 20 years. So Chris, I did the other solution. I think it depends on personality. And another thing that I find interesting, I think also supply chain management is a wonderful meeting point between an engineering perspective on the world and the business perspective on the world.
Yes.
And these are two very different sets of mindset. And I see in the MIT MicroMaster very much the engineering perspective which is very valuable. But I think there's a second one to that.
I agree. It's not a complete. I don't think anyone's done a good job doing it completely, because it's a different mode of education. You need to have, like Xavier said, kind of complementing this and having more of the interaction in person. Because the thing that I find so attractive about supply chain is very analytical, but it's very, people driven. Just because you can solve a model and get it quickly and you have an answer on paper, that doesn't mean anything if you can't convince a VP to get it done or to do something. So the power of persuasion of person to person, I think, is just as valuable, if not more, than the analytical skills. And that's something that is very hard to teach online. That's why you need to complement it. And that's what it sounds like what you guys are doing. Yeah. Great. I think consultancy is awesome. I've been a consultant a lot too. I didn't mean to be demeaning. It's just that you got to get your hands dirty.
Okay, so we have 8 minutes left with Dr. Caplice. So you want to ask some questions, just please jump in. I'm going to ask you, Chris, and of course, Thorsten and Xavier also, please jump in if you want to complement. What are some of the emerging trends that you're seeing in supply chain management?
So, there's always the new technologies coming, right? And you hear about the new technology du jour. When I came back to MIT, it was all about RFID. RFID was going to change the world. Everyone would have tags. I remember having a conversation with Hal Lee when he came here. He was a really renowned professor out of Stanford. And the thing we spent a day talking about is if you have an RFID tag on a chicken, and if you break the chicken up into drumsticks, how do you make sure that the barcode, you can trace it back? It was asinine, right? But that was the thing. That was the thing we were thinking about. How do you have, father and children and tying things together? And so I think the big thing is that a lot of technologies will come and go. And I think one of the interesting things that supply chain hopefully helps you do is say, okay, here's a cool idea. How does it fit? Where does it fit within it? Because there is no silver bullet. We've seen the same thing from RFID to then blockchain. Bitcoin is another one that's come and gone. And now Internet of Things, they all have great roles somewhere. And now we're seeing autonomous trucking. We're starting to see that. And I think Europe's a little ahead of what the US is, and probably Australia's even further. But it's not going to be like we're going to have robots driving everything everywhere. So I think for me, the biggest challenge that I've seen is having the ability to process and say, okay, here's this new technology. It's sexy. It's on the hype curve, right? Where does it really fit for me?
What I think is paramount these days in supply chain management and in most supply chains is certainly the ability of making things come. So if you're going to be at the end of the supply chain, what you need is no disruption in your upper echelons of your chain. And that today is paramount. That is highly relevant. And I think a lot of minds have been trying to solve this. We are no longer in the world where we were in 4 years ago. And that is to stay. I mean, to say it will never come back. And as it doesn't come back, that means that a lot of thinking should be going into how do we make our supply chains more resilient. Yeah, the notion of resilience is becoming much more important than it used to be. And there is no simple solution. There are no particular softwares that can help. And I think that it has all to do with preparation, and it has all to do also with organization and collaboration between the different people in the chain. And that's very much a people's skill.
I agree. But so when you talk about resilience, because we've been doing this for a long time up here, after 9/11, it really picked up because that was such a changing, that event. But so the way we looked at it for resilience, you've got two tools, right? And this goes back to my discussion of trade-offs for SC1X. You can be flexible or you can be redundant. Right. And everything we teach you for inventory is all about redundancy. How much extra inventory do I need for safety stock to cover unexpected demand or unexpected delay in lead time? And we can mathematically figure that out exactly. right? And so, but that's just one tool. What we don't teach as much is the flexibility. So if I want to, and I think I do this a little bit in the news vendor problem with the Tom Brady, the Patriots jerseys, is the whole idea there is instead of building extra inventory, you have a different channel. And so I'm able to switch or flip. So you've got flexibility, which requires some advanced investment. And then you've got redundancy. And you can build redundancy in terms of increased capacity, increased inventory. But those are the kind of two tools you have. And so we have a game called the Screen game, which I don't know, do they still use? Is that 3X or 4X?
It's 3X.
3X. Did they use it?
I'm not sure. I think it's not there anymore.
Yeah, because it's a tool that could be done honestly in person. And so what you're doing is trying to figure out how do you make this simple supply chain resilient. And it's really the trade-off between the two. But it does require both an analytical side, but also personnel and dealing with people. I agree.
Maybe, Chris, another question that relates to what you asked before. People in supply chain management in the past, I would say most of them were more analytical focused, and they were thinking about how to optimize things, how to improve things. And to some extent, of course, always there was something crazy going on. And for that, you typically need another mindset of people, so not the optimizers. I think maybe this is currently changing. So when in the old supply chain departments, it was a lot about introverts and optimization. Now it's kind of, okay, there's a fire. Let's kind of solve the fire and let's solve the problem, even if it's not an optimization. So do we need different mindsets of people?
It could be, you know, and I think a lot of it is the technology that was dominant. And so the 90s, early 2000s, that's when optimization really hit the PC. And it came down to a smaller scale. You didn't need a mainframe to solve these problems. And that's when all the TMSs came out, the network design, think of I2, all these big systems came out where I could actually run an optimization problem of significant size on a client server, using antiquated computer term, right? So that dictated, and people thought, oh, I have this computing power now. I can solve this exactly. And I think you're exactly right. It was kind of the revenge of the nerds, right? The mathematicians came out and they solved this problem exactly. But then what happened in 2010 to the last 10, 15 years, and I'm guilty of this, is that people are finally recognizing that there's uncertainty and variability, because we used to assume that away. And now I think the focus is on that variability. How do you handle uncertainty? It's not going away. It's what the definition of reality is for that thing which you don't believe in still happens anyway, right? And so this is a lot of the optimization would assume away uncertainty and find the best optimal blue sky plan when in fact it couldn't implement. And the challenge was all the brains went into that planning tool, none of the brains into execution. That's shifted over the last 5-10 years. And in fact, I was talking to the founder of Uber Freight, Bill Brigger, who's an alum of the program, and he said that execution trumps planning, and that without clean execution, you know, whatever your plan is, it doesn't make sense. Because what you're saying, Thorsten, all the effort was in creating the perfect plan, not thinking about how you'd execute. And I agree, that's a totally different skill. And I think more people are being drawn to that. But on the other hand, you have to make sure that you're just not a fireman and putting out a fire here, looking for root causes. And so I think there's value in both, but I think we went overboard with the planning, and then you can create to the 17th decimal place optimal plan, and it's like just make orders of magnitude decisions. So I think I agree with you, and I think there is a trade-off between how involved you want to get in the planning versus the execution. That makes sense? I kind of rambled.
No, thanks, Chris. And I think there's also a lot of innovation going on right now in supply chain management too. Like, right, it's becoming a creator of value, not just a cost object for companies. So with all this, the omni-channel and the transformation, you know, of the demand, I think like there's so much room for innovation now that it's very fun to be in the field. So we hit the time. So Chris, any final recommendations for SKEMA students that are taking the MicroMasters, will be graduating next year?
You guys should feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is just my last name at MIT.edu, Caplice at MIT.edu. That's what happens when you went through when the internet was, email was being invented. You get to have a really simple one because they hadn't all been taken yet. So just Caplice at MIT.edu. Please feel free to reach out and enjoy the lessons. But I think take to heart that this is just one side of things. What you're doing in class is equally important, and sometimes even more. So the people side is something that we can't stress enough in the online, but it's there and it's an important component.
Thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate your time today, and I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation with Dr. Caplice.
Thank you.
Have a good night.